But for tonight, we have Dr. Tim McGrew with us on screen. And when you have a question, because you're going to talk for an hour and then we have questions, right?
Sure.
Okay. So the camera's right here. So when you ask your question, direct your voice up here because the microphone is also right there.
Look at the red cup.
Huh?
Look at the red cup.
You look at the red cup.
Floating red cup.
Which is what the sign says. So Dr. McGrew is, where did you get your doctorate?
Vanderbilt University.
Vanderbilt. Good school. He is professor of philosophy at Western Michigan University. His major research interests are epistemology, history and philosophy of science, and philosophy of religion. He's a specialist in the philosophical application of probability theory. So if you wanted to do your homework tonight on probability theory, there's a man to ask. So we will go ahead and get started.
All right, I'm going to try to share the screen here, so bear with me while I fumble around inaptly with the technology. We'll see what we can do here. Tell me if you can see this now.
Yes, we can.
All right. Well, we're starting off with a bang. Thanks so much for inviting me to come here. I've met a couple of you. I've met Donald, I've met Paige at the national conference a year ago. Wasn't able to make it out there this year, but it's always fun to meet people who are interested in some of the same things that I am. Donald asked me if I'd give a talk on the topic, Are Miracles Believable? And I'm really glad to see that there are some members of the Philosophy Club there, because I am going to go directly into some of the philosophy. But I always like to start these talks with a little epigraph. This time I thought I would take one from an experimental scientist, François Arago. In an elegy for a colleague, he writes, "Doubt is a proof of modesty. It has seldom harmed the progress of the sciences. I could not say as much for incredulity. Apart from pure mathematics, whoever pronounces the word impossible is wanting in prudence." By the time we're done today, I hope that you can see why I chose this as an epigraph for this particular talk. The question is, are miracles believable? Let's refine that a little bit when we get into it. We'll offer a definition of miracle in a moment, but before we do, let's just sharpen this up. I mean, there's obviously, in one sense, miracles are believable. People do believe in them. So that's not the sense that's interesting. The question is it reasonable for us, in at least some particular cases, to believe, on the basis of the evidence we actually have, that a miracle has occurred? And unfortunately, there's a great deal of ground clearing that we've got to do before we can get through to the giving and taking of specific evidence. And the reason for that is this guy, David Hume, whom I have dubbed the Prince of Skeptics. His argument against the credibility of reported miracles, first published in 1748, has been the most influential argument in possibly the whole history of modern philosophy. It is enormously influential. It has certainly dominated philosophy classes when I was taking classes. But it suffered a change of fortunes in recent years. Around the turn of the century, John Ehrman, who is not a religious believer of any kind whatsoever, wrote a book entitled Hume's Abject Failure, the Argument Against Miracles. And for somebody who has manifestly no apologetic agenda, he's absolutely unsparing. It's almost painful. It is, he says, almost universally assumed by Hume's admirers and critics alike that Of Miracles offers a powerful and original argument against miracles. On the contrary, I contend that Hume's argument is largely derivative, almost wholly without merit, where it is original, and worst of all, reveals the impoverishment of his treatment of inductive reasoning. Wow, okay, let's dive in and see what Ehrman might be talking about. Hume makes 3 points about reported miracles, which I am going to controvert. So the points that I would like to make are the following, which I think are eminently supportable, but many of you have been trained perhaps in a different way. Number one, the existence of a stable order of nature does not count as evidence against the existence of miracles. I'll try to make plain why that is the case, particularly with regard to religious miracles, in a moment. Number two, it ought to be possible to change one's mind about miracles. And it seems like a very mild statement to me, but Hume denies it. We'll see why. Number 3, the proper way to arrive at a reasonable belief is to examine the evidence in detail. This also seems to me to be an obvious truth, but it is something that Hume has, in principle, blocked himself off from doing, and would also block you off if you were to follow his counsel. So let's first go into point number 1. The claim I'm making is the existence of a stable order of nature does not count as evidence against the existence of miracles. Well, who would deny that? Hume, specifically. That is, in fact, his master argument for the first part of his famous essay. A miracle, he says, is, notice, here comes a definition, a violation of the laws of nature. And as a firm and unalterable experience has established these laws, the proof against a miracle from the very nature of the fact is as entire as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined. So the fact that there is an order of nature in which normal things, not miraculous, are what happen, is, from Hume's point of view, as entire as any argument from experience can be imagined against miracles. So we've got overwhelming evidence on the negative side. Whatever you can put up on the positive side, if it gets into an arm wrestling contest with evidence as entire as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined, well, that evidence isn't going to lose the contest. So that's the way that Hume sets this up. William Adams was a contemporary of Hume, and in fact, Hume remarked on Adams' essay in response to him that Adams had treated him better than he deserved. Adams is very polite, but he's also very direct. Here's what Adams has to say. An experienced uniformity in the course of nature hath been always thought necessary to the belief and use of miracles. These are indeed relative ideas. There must be an ordinary, regular course of nature before there can be anything extraordinary. A river must flow before its stream can be interrupted. Now that's a shrewd point that I think Hume has entirely overlooked. In trying to oppose a stable background of nature to a miracle, Hume is trying to set up a kind of inductive case against miracles. Well, you haven't seen one, and I haven't seen one, and we've been around for a few years, and your uncle never actually saw a miracle, and a lot of people you know don't even claim to have seen a miracle, so there's all this inductive evidence. Now, members of the philosophy club would realize the amusing irony in Hume's using an inductive argument against the credibility of miracles, because the other argument from this very book, this philosophical essays, now more commonly known as the Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, the other most famous argument from this book is an attack on the rational cogency of inductive reasoning. So here's Hume in this piece using induction to try to create an insurmountable case against belief in miracles, even though he's the guy who has been criticizing induction just a few chapters earlier. Kind of a fine point. Here I think is a better definition. Laws of nature tell us how nature behaves when it is left to itself. They don't tell us whether or how often it is left to itself. So it would be misleading to say, as Hume does, that a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, because that gives us the feeling that it could take place only if the laws were false, or we had the wrong laws or something. It's a violation of what we call the causal closure of the physical world. If you've studied some thermodynamics, you're familiar with the use that we make of closed, isolated systems. We have these systems that are isolated from other inputs, and we describe how they evolve across time, and we've got some partial differential equations we can run out showing us how that is supposed to work, but that all presupposes that the system remains closed and isolated. If someone intervenes into that system, bets are off. We no longer have a description of how things are going to happen if intervention can take place. So here's a general principle of evidence, and this is the only time in the entire talk when I will put up anything that is even a tiny bit mathy. So for those of you who are allergic to math, I don't know why you're at the Colorado School of Mines. But anyway, if you are allergic, this would be the time to pull out that epinephrine pen and have it handy, because here comes just a tiny little bit. I got this down to the minimum possible. If, on the supposition that M were true, I've very cleverly chosen M to stand for miracle, it would be inevitable that O also be true. Then O cannot be evidence against M. And here comes the math. If the probability of O given M equals 1, then the probability of M given O is greater than or equal to the probability of M. That is, O doesn't decrease the probability of M. Might increase it, can't decrease it. Okay, great as an abstract point, but I'm trying to claim that the stability of the background of nature, when left to itself, is something that is inevitable if there are miracles, at least miracles functioning in religious context. Why would that be? Well, it has to do with this notion of signs. The word miracle never actually occurs in the New Testament. There are various words that point that direction, but there is no one word that just means miracle. There are signs and wonders and works of power. But I'm most interested in this notion of signs. In religious context, miracles are supposed to function as signs. They're supposed to tell you, hey, something of great significance is up here. This teacher has a message that is endorsed by God. This teacher comes from God. This teaching is something that God wants you to know. And if they function as signs, that would be impossible unless they took place against the backdrop of a stable natural order, because that's what enables them to function as signs. How do you know that someone's message comes from God? How do you know that it's not just brilliant rhetoric or ingenious philosophy, but still just something some human being made up? Well, something needs to happen that doesn't happen unless God is stepping in and making it happen. But for us to know what the difference is between times when God is stepping in and times when He's not, there's got to be a way things function when God isn't specifically intervening to bring these things about. I like to call this the Nicodemus test. For those of you who can remember your New Testament will remember that in John chapter 3, Nicodemus comes to Jesus by night, and he says, "Teacher, we know that you are sent from God because no man can do these signs that you do unless God is with him." This is how we know. We're looking at this stuff that you're doing and we're saying, nobody gets to do that unassisted. That's the mark of divine endorsement, divine favor. Therefore, the existence of a stable order of nature cannot be used as an argument against miracles in religious context. They presuppose it. For those of you who don't like math and you don't like arguments laid out premise by premise, we'll do it in pictures. Okay? Here is a sign, and it's a sign on which I have written a message. And the message is one that I think is tremendously important. Unfortunately, I have used the same color for the background that I used for the font. So it doesn't work very well, does it? You look at this and you say, I can't even tell if he is putting a sign up there, and I have no idea what it says. If there is a sign up there, that just looks like a blank. But what if the sign stood out against the background? Then we might get this. That's somewhat more helpful. That's the point that I'm making. You have to have a background against which the sign makes a contrast in order for you to be able to read the message, in order for you to be able to get the point. That is the point that Hume is missing with his first objection. Point number 2, it ought to be possible to change one's mind about miracles. Now, this seems to me so obvious, and they're contingent matters of fact. You should be able to change your mind about matters of fact. All I'm claiming is it should be possible to change your mind. I'm not claiming that in every case the evidence is equally good. That would be stupid. We know that's not true. But that it should be possible to change one's mind. Doesn't that seem like a kind of a minimal requirement for going about these things in an evidence-based way? Well, unfortunately, Hume has kind of put his foot in it here. I'm going to use a quotation from William James, because James didn't really have any religious sympathies, and I think that it's useful sometimes to remind people that this is not simply a piece of apologetics. This is part of good thinking that people acknowledge from outside the realm of specific religions. James says, a rule of thinking which would absolutely prevent me from acknowledging certain kinds of truth, if those kinds of truth were really there, would be an irrational rule. I call this sometimes the trapdoor fallacy. If you've locked yourself into believing something that is not a logical or mathematical truth, and you have done so in such a way that you are impervious to being reasoned out of it, then if you are wrong, you will never find out. So we always need to keep before us the question, when should I change my mind? If I am wrong, how will I know? think about that now with regard to the kind of skepticism that Hume propounds. Some quotations, and by the way, bless your soul if you're trying to take notes. I don't expect anybody to get all this stuff down because I'm violating every rule of PowerPoint by putting this much text on slides. I will give these slides to Don. He is free to share them with any of you, and my email address if you want that, if you want to correspond about them. So you'll have all these quotations and all the references also. Here's Hume on not changing one's mind about miracles. First quotation. He therefore concluded like a just reasoner. This is somebody who reported that a miracle had happened but didn't believe it himself. That such an evidence carried falsehood upon the very face of it, and that a miracle supported by any human testimony was more properly a subject of derision than of argument. Notice how strong the language is here. Supported by any human testimony. We're not just saying that this or that particular miracle is rather amusing, fitly supported, transparently false. And we all have our favorite examples of those things. But a miracle supported by any human testimony was more properly a subject of derision than of argument. It does not sound like somebody who's going to have an easy time changing his mind in the face of evidence if he is wrong. Again, but should this miracle, this hypothetical example, be ascribed to any new system of religion, men in all ages have been so much imposed on by ridiculous stories of that kind, that this very circumstance would be a full proof of a cheat, and sufficient with all men of sense, not only to make them reject the fact, but even reject it without farther examination. So his claim here is, miracle claims at the origin of a religion, well, those are particularly dismissible. Anyone who has good sense should reject it without even looking into the matter. If you reject things without looking into them, and you are wrong, how will you find out that you are wrong? Again, and I'm not beating this drum, partly because I have ESP and knew that members of the Philosophy Club would be there. And partly, it's a miracle. And partly because I think it's so important that we understand how extreme a position Hume has backed himself into. As the violations of truth, he says, are more common in the testimony concerning religious miracles than in that concerning any other matter of fact, this must diminish very much the authority of the former testimony and make us form a general resolution never to lend any attention to it with whatever specious pretense it may be covered. In other words, form it as a general rule to pay no attention to any evidence for a miracle, no matter what. If he is wrong, how will he find out? When should he change his mind? A test case outside of the religious realm. I like to think about meteorites as opposed to meteors. Meteors are those little blips that you see flickering across the sky, flaming out. They're about the size of a grain of rice, maybe, and they never make it down to Earth. But meteorites come all the way down, and we have some fun with those. How many of you have actually touched a meteorite? Anybody ever? Yes, I see hands going up. Great. Well, suckers, if you had just followed David Hume's advice, you would have known better. And for a while, most people actually did have this, at least most learned people, did have a fine contempt for this idea that rocks fall from the sky. One of the reasons is that there are lots of stories among ancient people about stones that fall from heaven, and often these stones are invested with some kind of religious significance, and so the idea that these stories might actually be true was something that was widely derided in the late 18th century. The scientists in particular were incredulous about these kinds of things. Rocks falling from the sky. Really? Come on now. Let's be serious. And the testimony was often the testimony of peasants, and we all know that peasants don't know anything, so we could just dismiss what they have to say out of hand. Here are some examples of the incredulity of scientists, and these are not just cherry-picked crackpots on the borders of science. Antoine Lavoisier is the father of modern chemistry. He dismissed written affidavits that the stones were still warm when they were discovered. And he reportedly changed one of the affidavits, actually marked it out, arguing that the rocks must have been artificially warmed. And these poor, stupid peasants, how would they know anyway? Pro tip. Do not do this. Do not change people's affidavits. Argue if you like that they're stupid. Argue if you like that they must have been deceived, but leave the damn affidavit alone. Don't tamper with the evidence. This is bad. Even great scientists need to be reminded, apparently, that this is not a good procedure if you want to find the truth. And I love Lavoisier in a lot of other ways, but what a boneheaded thing to do. Really, guy. Get with it. He's not alone, though. Pierre-Simon Marquis de Laplace interrupted a presentation at the French Academy of Sciences shouting, "We already know enough such fables." Well, thank you for that little testimony from the heart, Mr. Laplace. But if you are wrong, how will you know? This is a presentation at the French Academy of Sciences by people who were scientifically trained, arguing from some recent information regarding falls of meteors that these should be taken seriously. Well, Laplace was totally uninterested in any such fables. Hence, Gladini writes in 1819 that disbelief and scorn was so common that many museums had discarded their collections of meteorites for fear of being ridiculed by people like Laplace. Not so much by Lavoisier, since he lost his head in the French Revolution. Bad move. Revolutions in science don't mix well. Okay. My third point. The proper way to arrive at a reasonable belief is to examine the evidence in detail. I feel funny sometimes saying things like this because they seem to be so obvious. I worry that people will say, yeah, but nobody would deny that. But people do deny that. Hume denies that. Hume starts out in a promising way. Here's what he says in his essay on miracles. When anyone tells me that he saw a dead man restored to life, I immediately consider with myself whether it would be more probable that this person should either deceive or be deceived, or that the fact which he relates should really have happened. I weigh the one miracle against the other. Improbability is what he means by miracle here. And according to the superiority which I discover, I pronounce my decision and always reject the greater miracle. If the falsehood of his testimony would be more miraculous than the event which he relates, then, and not till then, can he pretend to command my belief or opinion. So, there's the challenge laid down. You want me to believe you, then you've got to show me testimony that would be more miraculous than the event that you're claiming. Good luck with that. What do you think the response of people reading Hume was in the 18th century and the early 19th century? How do you think people would respond today? If you went into your pastor and you said, okay, pastor, this is a challenge given to me by my philosophy professor. How should we respond to this? What do you think they'd say? I'm not asking you what you would say at this point. I'm asking you what you think most people would say that you are familiar with. Did it just take, the little old church lady, to use the old Saturday Night Live trope? What kind of response do you think you'd get? Go ahead. Ooh, everybody's looking at everybody else. Don't say anything.
Take it on faith? Is that what you're going for? Take
it on faith. You think that's a response? How many of you could at least see the plausibility that you would give that as a response? You think? Maybe. What else?
Depends on what crowd.
Depends on what crowd, right? I'm just asking you for, your average pastor or your average churchgoer. Nobody feels confident saying anything much more robust, do you? Or you would have said it already.
You can say, what's the saying? The Bible says that I believe it, that settles it. So, that it's in the Bible, so...
Right, so we could just, punt to the Bible, say, but I really, really love the Bible. It's so inspiring to me. Maybe I should just go with that. All right, let's see how one of Hume's critics actually responded. Exactly. No statement could be more reasonable. Let us proceed then to the comparison. The Christian has to produce testimony to miracle, whose falsehood would be a mightier wonder than the miracle attested. And Hume has to weigh miracle against miracle. Game on. Go for it. What was the next step to be taken in Hume's argument? What did his own statement require him to do? Clearly, to take up the miracles which Christians allege to be true, to set their evidence fully and distinctly forth, and to point out that however plausible that evidence might be, its fallaciousness would be no miracle compared with the miracle affirmed, says Peter Bain in his book, The Testimony of Christ or Christianity. Go for it. I like that. Beautiful, Hume. You've laid it out. Shall we go for that? But, as Bain continues, every reader of Hume's essay knows that he has done nothing of the sort. The nature of the evidence required for the Christian miracles, once fairly stated, those miracles are quietly put by him out of court. The trial proceeds by proxy. Hume does not ask what proof is offered that the Christian miracles took place. He calls to the bar certain miracles with which Christianity has nothing to do, enters upon their evidence, condemns them as falsities, and then calmly informs the court that the Christian miracles are disproven. This is like hauling somebody into court for rape and spending your entire time talking about other people who have committed rape. And at the end, urging the jury to convict this person at the bar. Yeah, but is there any evidence that he has done it? You can't try him by proxy. You can't bring in other people, talk about them, and then pronounce upon this. What is going on? What Hume actually discusses in the second part of his essay are three occasions. He discusses two miraculous cures attributed to the future Emperor Vespasian. He mentions an alleged cure in Saragossa of a man's amputated leg by the application of holy oil. Cardinal de Retz mentions that in his memoirs. And some healings alleged to have happened at the tomb of the Abbé Paris in the early 1700s after that notable cleric had died. And none of these are miracles that are fundamental to the Christian claims. None of them. And he never discusses that at all. Well, maybe he didn't have much to work with the Christian miracles. Not true. Hume was a latecomer to the deist controversy. There were numerous writers who had laid out meticulously arguments for the resurrection. Philip Doddridge had done so. John Leland had done so. Samuel Chandler had done so. Nathaniel Lardner had done so. Zachary Pierce had done this. The arguments were already out there, laid out by people who were writing during Hume's own lifetime. He could have engaged with any of them. He chose not to. He chose instead to do the trial by proxy. But maybe you're thinking, yeah, okay, hold it though, hold it. There's something wrong going on here. It requires more evidence to establish a miraculous claim than it does to establish an ordinary one, right? How many of you know a saying that begins, extraordinary claims, finish it for me.
Require extraordinary evidence.
Require extraordinary evidence, right? You can say it in your best Christopher Hitchens voice if you like. So yeah, while you're making an extraordinary claim here, you've got to show me more evidence than you would for an ordinary claim. I don't think the extraordinary claims version of that is so plausible. The plausible form, I think we can work with. The implausible form, however, is usually used as an argument stopper. What exactly does that slogan mean? I've done more reading around on the internet than I probably should. It's not good for my soul. But in doing it, I think I have figured out what is usually meant. What the argument is that usually lies behind this, and it goes like this. Because that claim, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, was made famous by Carl Sagan, who was the first presenter for Cosmos before Neil deGrasse Tyson rebooted that. I have christened this the Argumentum Sagani. Here we go. It runs like this. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The claim that a miracle has occurred is extraordinary. Therefore, any evidence supporting it ought to be extraordinary as well. I'm not sure what I mean by extraordinary. But whatever you come up with, it's not going to work. Therefore, no one is justified in believing any miracle claim. Yeah, who could possibly deny any of the premises of this argument? Not helpful. But what about the more moderate version of it? Well, let's do a little scientific test case here, right? You guys like science. According to one proposed theory in nuclear physics, spontaneous proton decay happens. Just really, really, really rarely. So rarely that so far no instances have ever been observed. So there is a uniform experience against spontaneous proton decay. So what do the scientists do? Pack it up, say, well, that plus David Hume will get you to a complete shutdown, so let's leave it off. No, it's an interesting theory. So they've set up sensitive detectors in underground water tanks in an attempt to see whether this actually takes place. They'd like to know. It would be important for particle physics if it happened. It would be important for particle physics if it didn't happen. They want to know whether it ever happens. So instead of saying, well, never seen it before, David Hume says, hang it up. That's as strong as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined. So let's just move on. They say, no, well, we could look and see. We could try this for a while. That's not necessarily a dumb thing to do. The fact that 100% of the protons so far observed have not decayed does not mean it's impossible for us to accept evidence of such decay. Sure, we got the evidence. We want to say, are we sure the detectors weren't malfunctioning? We might have some doubt about it at first, but we could, in principle, be persuaded. So in science, we don't follow Hume's rule. Here's something Thomas Sherlock wrote in his Trial of the Witnesses of the Resurrection. I do allow that this case and others of like nature require more evidence to give them credit than ordinary cases do. You may therefore require more evidence in these than in other cases, but it is absurd to say that such things admit no evidence when the things in question are quite manifestly objects of sense. Sherlock was the Bishop of London. His book, The Trial of the Witnesses of the Resurrection, went through numerous editions in the year that Hume turned 18. So Sherlock was here first. He said, sure, ask for more evidence, that's fair. What's not fair is rigging the game by setting it up so that no amount of evidence can work. Now, I suspect that some people here will say there's another problem, and it's the where to start problem. There are many religions and thousands upon thousands of miracle claims. Just try running through Hinduism sometime. You know what? That's right. That's absolutely true. How could anyone hope then to use miracles as evidence for a religion? I bet you want us to start with your religion, don't you? Right. Why should we pick yours rather than anyone else? How could we possibly run through all these? What if there are two religions that are absolutely contradictory to one another and they both have miracles? Where do we go then? All right. Let's beat that objection. There are neutral criteria that make no reference to any particular religious creed and can be seen to be reasonable without any appeal to one religion or another, that can help to filter out unpromising candidates for a religious miracle. There are criteria that give us reason to doubt. Let's look at some of those. John Douglas wrote a book, The Criterion, a response to Hume, written while Hume was alive. Hume didn't die until 1776, the year of the American Revolution. Douglas said a miracle claim may reasonably be doubted when it is reported only long after the miracle is supposed to have happened. So if I tell you, in 1921, a miracle happened in the town where I grew up, you're going to say, well, thanks for telling us now. Do you have any references to it that are any earlier than 2018? And I say, no, actually, and I know 97 years is a long time, but honest, this is what happened. You're probably not going to take me seriously. Why? Because a very great delay in the time of reporting makes it very easy for someone to perpetrate a fraud and very difficult for people to check up on it. Second criterion put forward by Bishop Douglas, the Bishop of Salisbury. It is reported only at a great distance from the scene. If I say to you, you know what, last week, a guy turned water into wine. You say, really, where? I say, well, he's a Sherpa. He's a guide in the Himalayas. And he doesn't do it very often, but last week he did it. Probably not many of you are going to get out of the room and go and make a trip to the Himalayas and see if you can track down the Sherpa. So if I were putting it forward as a pious fraud, I could probably get away with it if it were reported only at a great distance from the scene. Third criterion, it would have been allowed when first made to pass without examination. The This is a very important one because it means there's room to doubt when a miracle claim falls in with the prejudices of the surrounding people, falls in with their religious beliefs that are already formed. So if I look at the miracles of ecclesiastical history, I look at the saints' miracles, which are propounded among devout people who are already inclined to believe their faith, those claims may reasonably be doubted by Douglas's third criterion. Let's just go down quickly through some examples. So when the report comes along after the event, Philostratus has the life of Apollonius of Tyana, written over a century after the death of Apollonius. There are no earlier sources that corroborate most of his stories, any of his miraculous stories. The only earlier analogs that we have for this is that it looks like he's doing rip-offs of things from the Gospels and Acts, which is not surprising since Philostratus was writing with the patronage of Julia Domna to establish a religion as a competitor to Christianity at that time. The lives of Pythagoras do contain miracle accounts, but they were written 8 centuries after the death of that philosopher. Many of the miracle claims of the Middle Ages, Christian miracle claims about saints and monks, were propagated only long after the event. You get the first life of this person, it has nothing of the sort. You look for a second or a third one written 40, 80, 100 years later, miracle stories start to creep in and crop up. Failing on the second criterion, when the first report of the miracle is made only at a great distance from the alleged event, nearly everything attributed to Apollonius is at a great distance from the place where he is writing and propagating this. On the third criterion, the claim would be allowed to pass without critical examination because it supports or affirms established opinions and prejudices. Virtually all of the miracles of ecclesiastical history. So you read about Saint Genevieve, who is so holy that as she walks, flowers spring up from the places where her feet have trod. Not a lot of people interested in doing a critical takedown of Saint Genevieve. The healings attributed to Vespasian in Alexandria. Vespasian was an aspirant to the imperial throne. In fact, he became emperor shortly thereafter. And the miracles were attributed to the local deity, Serapis, who was getting a certain amount of competition from Christianity in Alexandria at the time, so they could kind of use a miracle on both sides. Might have been allowed to pass without examination. The alleged restoration of a man's leg in Saragossa was used to whip up the faithful, particularly against the depredations of those terrible people, the Protestants. Might have been allowed to pass without careful examination. Hume says in the first edition of his work that the cardinal examined the man's leg and found it a natural leg like his other. In the second edition, he withdraws that claim because it's just not true. I've gone through and found in de Retz's memoirs in the French the actual place where he describes it. All he says is, I saw him with 2. End of discussion. William Adams, back to him again, he has a wonderful quotation on this point. There is a wide difference betwixt establishing false miracles by the help of a false religion and establishing a false religion with the help of false miracles. Nothing is more easy than the former of these, or more difficult than the latter. If you want to test this, then I have a test that you can do. And it's very simple. I'll buy you a one-way plane ticket for you to go somewhere and start a new religion. And these are the criteria. You've got to start the religion, and the religion has got to be in contradiction to the dominant religion in the place where you want to start it. Okay? So you get your choice. You can get a free one-way plane ticket to start your new religion to Milwaukee, or I'll buy you a plane ticket to Mecca. Now, you go to Milwaukee, you're probably going to have something of a hard time, but you might be able to fake some people into believing that you're doing something miraculous. You go to Mecca, you'll be dead before you hit baggage claim. You're not allowed to go to Mecca unless you are a devout Muslim. So that's just not the place to start it. You'd be fighting in the teeth of very violent opposition there. Where did Christianity arise? In Jerusalem, by the testimony of Tacitus, the Roman historian. It began in Jerusalem, where Jesus was crucified. in the teeth of the religious and the civil authorities. Now that's doing it the hard way. That's doing it where you cannot expect people's prejudices to fall in with what you are doing. A concluding moral from one of the great theologians of our time, Sherlock Holmes. It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts. And I'll follow this up with a quotation very much in the same line from G.K. Chesterton, and specifically about miracles from his book Orthodoxy. But before I quite get there, you might say, well, wait, what evidence? We need facts. All right, here's some neglected lines of evidence, and I'll just mention these. I'm not going to go into them in detail, and we can talk about them in the Q&A if you want more. The evidence of incidental allusions, in which authors mention in passing details of setting and circumstance that it would be hard to get right at a later date. The evidence of undesigned coincidences, where multiple historical accounts interlock with and explain one another. Fictions and forgeries do not do that. The evidence of artless similarity, in which different scenes penned by different authors disclose the same personality. Those are neglected lines of evidence I think we would do well to recover. I've got talks that I could give you on any of those, and I would love for you to go after them. I am persuaded that Chesterton is right when he writes, somehow or other, an extraordinary idea has arisen that the disbelievers in miracles consider them coldly and fairly, while believers in miracles accept them only in connection with some dogma. The fact is quite the other way. The believers in miracles accept them, rightly or wrongly, because they have evidence for them. The disbelievers in miracles deny them, rightly or wrongly, because they have a doctrine against them. And now I think you've seen enough of David Hume to see exactly what Chesterton has in mind. Hey, free books. Who wouldn't want free books, right? Go here. Apologetics.org. You can download PDFs of a number of books, including books that I've discussed tonight. I've given you quotations from Sherlock, Campbell, Adams, Douglas. Those are all books that you can pick up and read for free. They're in public domain. There's no piracy involved. So go knock yourself out. Get free stuff. Free stuff is good. All right. So that having been said, and ending on a note that no one can disagree with, I will come back and see you guys in person. And have I left enough time for us to do some Q&A? I hope so.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Then rock it. Go ahead. Nobody likes to ask the first question, so my friend Frank Turek likes to say, let's just skip that and move on to the second question.
I'm going to run to an exam. See you guys.
Bye.
Can you give us some examples of artless similarity?
Artless similarity, sure. So some examples of this come up in the descriptions in the Gospels of Jesus' personality. He's got a manner of teaching that is not the manner that Paul has. It's not the manner of Gamaliel or Hillel or Shammai or any of the other Jewish sages of the time. He likes to teach using examples that are drawn from his surroundings. And you find this in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And then you find the same trait of personality in different scenes that are not in the Synoptics in the Gospel of John. So, for example, his disciples are quibbling about who's going to be greatest in the kingdom of heaven. So he takes a little child and he puts the child in front of them. And he says, if you want to be great in the kingdom of heaven, you've got to become like a little child. So object lesson right there in front of their faces. When his disciples are arguing about who's going to be great in the kingdom of heaven at the Last Supper, John 13 tells us Jesus rose, laid aside his cloak, put a towel around his waist, and washed their feet, a menial job you could not even demand that a Jewish slave do. If you go over to the parallel passage in Luke, you'll find Jesus saying, I am among you as one who serves. What's he doing? He's giving them an object lesson in humility. If you look at the personality of Peter as it comes across in the Gospel of Mark, and you compare it to the Gospel of John, in scenes where Mark doesn't even have the same scene, it's the same guy. If you look at the personalities of Mary and Martha across the Gospels in Luke and in John, you'll find that they're just stamped with the same character. They're the same people, the same kind of forwardness. In John 11, Martha comes out when Jesus comes, because Lazarus has died. Martha comes out and she says to him, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And she clearly means this to say, like, so why weren't you here? And when Mary comes out, she says, Rabbi, if you were here, my brother would not have died. But she intends no rebuke of it. And the framing of the story shows you this. It's the same personality that you see. It's the same Martha who told Jesus to tell Mary to come and help her serve the meal, because Mary was just sitting there listening, and that was kind of a crazy thing. So these are examples of artless similarity, and there are many examples of that. Many examples where you can see the same people coming out, the same personality traits coming out, even though the scenes are different. When the people are the same, you can tell this. Like I said, a neglected line of argument, but you can, get a free book on it and read up on it.
Isn't this often explained away by when people say that all of the people related to this, like your Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they all just got together and wrote these at the same time using the same kind of notes?
Nobody, I think, believes that today, except maybe some people on the internet where you can find anything. But the reason that nobody believes it is that there are so many differences in the Gospels. Differences in the selection of material, differences in the way that certain scenes are depicted, that the real question is, why did they let so many differences slip through, right? I mean, one of the major lines of objection, I think it can be well answered, to the resurrection is, but there are so many differences in the resurrection narratives, you can't even get one and the same account of who the women were who came to the tomb on the morning of the resurrection. Well, in one account we just have, Mary there saying, yeah, she says, we do not know where they have laid it. That suggests there were others, but we don't know who they were. And one of them, you get Susanna, Joanna, why is it that we don't just have one list? Well, it's because different people were not writing from the same set of notes. They weren't reading off the Cliff Notes. It wasn't like they were delivering carbon copies. The resurrection accounts of all of the parts of the Gospels are the accounts that are most distinctive and different from one another. Unlike, say, the feeding of the 5,000 in Matthew, the feeding of the 5,000 in Mark, where it looks like Matthew may have been making use of Mark's account as a basis. Here, you don't have that at all. Some of the undesigned coincidences also, I think, really decisively tell against the idea that it was just rip-offs of one Earth source. I can go into examples of that if you're interested.
Thank you, that's a good explanation.
Go for it.
I'm interested in, so obviously something like the resurrection that would be a miracle great enough to establish a religion would need kind of overwhelming evidence. And I've heard different things about there being like thousands of people there. What do you know about like the evidence of that?
Okay,
on
right, so first of all, let's go to the overwhelming evidence. Why does it need overwhelming evidence? Why not just enough evidence for a quite unusual kind of thing, which it is? If you say it requires overwhelming evidence, I need to know what is the presumption on the other side that makes overwhelming evidence required. I think there's ample evidence, more than enough evidence, but whenever I hear the word overwhelming, I worry that somebody's going to say, no, I have a different definition of overwhelming. Well, what's your definition? More than you've got, okay? Back to the argument of Sagani. And I worry about that. How many witnesses of the resurrection were there? Let's get real specific. If we're talking about the event of Jesus emerging from the tomb, we don't have any. And it's curious that people felt like it would be kind of cool if we did have some. And so there's this cross gospel, which is a Gnostic piece that got written in the 2nd century that does have Jesus coming out of the tomb and commending his disciples who are there watching him, and as they see him come out, he comes out followed by a gigantic cross, which somehow got crammed into the tomb, and it's like 70 or 80 feet tall, and it's hopping along after him, and there are voices from the clouds. You look at all this stuff, and then you look at the actual narratives from the 1st century documents, and you say, okay, it's Sesame Street time. Which of these things is not like the other? Those accounts are fairly sober. They're pretty straightforward. This account is wildly festooned with these kinds of extra trappings. Same thing happens when you read the story of the feeding of the 5,000 in an Arabic version, Hayat al-Qulub. It's not enough for there to be 5,000 people. It's no. Jesus has to clap his hands, and a table descends from heaven, and the food's already on the table. And there's a fish lying there, and it's wonderfully spiced. And he says, "By the will of Allah, live!" And the fish starts flopping around, and the disciples run away. But then the peasants come, and they eat, and all their diseases are healed, and old people become young. And then the disciples are kind of sad; they didn't eat any of it. And so Jesus claps his hands again, and another table descends from heaven, and they keep eating like this for 40 days. That's legend. You go back and you look at what we've got in our Gospels, and they look really tame by comparison. Now, there were a lot of people who were witnesses of the risen Jesus, and who Paul refers to in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, look, there were more than 500 people saw him at once. Some of those people are dead now, but most of them are still alive. And so he was writing this to the church at Corinth, where he had enemies who questioned his apostleship. So if he was bluffing, he was handing them the perfect weapon with which to discredit him. And Paul was not a dumb dummy. He would have known that. But he has no fear of being contradicted on this point, that there were that many people who saw him at once, that many of those people are still alive, and that's a standing invitation to his enemies to go ahead and try to refute him, which they can't and they don't.
I have a question. So you talked about Hume's criteria that you said you basically agreed with, where you compare the improbability of a false testimony to a miracle compared to the improbability of the miracle itself, correct?
Yes, but the testimony, I would just finesse it in one respect.
Yeah.
Hume's discussion of it considers only one person's testimony.
Sure.
We need to look at the question of multiple testimony, particularly when we have credible evidence that the testimony is independent, or even maybe more than independent, maybe negatively dependent. And that leads to an interesting kind of cumulative case argument, where we have to use the compound odds form of Bayes' theorem in order to calculate the probabilities. And it turns out that arguments of that kind are tremendously important in science, and they're tremendously important in other areas of history, and you can mount an argument like that, a cumulative argument with multiple pieces of evidence in this case as well. What you need in this case is a strong enough cumulative case to overcome the antecedent, and I agree, reasonable challenge. Yeah, but miracles, those are at least kind of rare things. We're not seeing them every day. We'd want more evidence for this, right, than for an ordinary event. Agreed, but I think the cumulative case argument presented, for example, in the article that my wife and I contributed to the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, is an example of such a cumulative case. So it's not just one person. One person you can say, look, maybe he's drunk, maybe he hallucinated, maybe he's just not feeling well, maybe he's mentally ill. But when you get many different people and many different lines of evidence, it's a lot harder to try to undermine the cumulative case than it is to try to take down individual bits of evidence. So with that qualification in mind, yeah, I would grant Hume's challenge, and I've actually written on this subject, and I would just address it straight up.
Yeah, okay, so I guess here was my question I was going to ask, if you want to do this in some kind of mathematical way, is how can you begin to get a number for the improbability of a miracle happening a priori? I mean, where would that number even come from?
Right, that's a great question. There's a book written by William Paley called A View of the Evidences of Christianity, and in his preparatory considerations, he addresses that question as directly as it can be addressed. He says, look, there are two circumstances which, taken together, make a miracle almost inevitable. Number one, that there's a God who has some kind of interest in our welfare, and number two, that there is some message that he wants to communicate to us in a way that we cannot rationally mistake that we cannot rationally ascribe to someone else. That probability, be it great or small, puts a boundary on the low probability of a miracle. If those two claims are true, miracles have to take place because that's the only way that God himself can certify a miracle to us, certify a teaching to us, is by working a miracle so that we say, this is not just a natural event, this is the voice of God. So that pushes it to the question, is there a God at all? Right? Which is an independent question from the question of, is Christianity true? There could be a God, but Judaism could be the true religion, or Islam or something like that. So that's that question, and the question, how improbable is it that such a being would have some message that he would wish us to get in a fashion we couldn't mistake? That's going to set you a boundary, and I think that's a useful way of approaching the question. If we approach it that way, I would say on independent grounds, leave miracles aside for the moment. If you find them problematic, we can give arguments for the existence of God. I think there are good arguments from the origin of the universe, from the origin of life, from the origin of consciousness, and I have talks where I go into those arguments as well. But those arguments, I think, make it quite credible that there is a God who at least plausibly might have a message to communicate to us, and at that point, that there's a miracle somewhere or other is almost inevitable, and the only question is, how do we do the sifting? And for that, I would suggest we use Douglas's criteria, which I think are good criteria. You can't investigate everything, but you should be able to start with the most promising candidates. If you use Douglas's criteria, there will be very few candidates left standing. More questions? Yeah, go.
Yeah, I think there are some good points. There was one that I'm curious about. You said a miracle claim may be doubted when it's reported only long after it supposedly happened, right?
Yeah.
Right. So how does that fit in with the Gospels and Paul's epistles having only been written decades after the resurrection happened?
Right, so good question. First of all, from a historical standpoint, if it's within the lifetime of people who were adults when the events happened, that's a pretty tight criteria. The Greek historian Polybius says you can accept accounts of things if they're accounts given to you by people who could have themselves talked to the eyewitnesses. So my daughter, when she was 12 or 13 years old, did an oral history project with our neighbor who was a World War II vet. He had fought Rommel in Africa. She took a tape recorder and went over and interviewed him for 4 hours. And she made recordings of everything, and with his permission, she made copies of those recordings, burned them onto CDs, and gave them to his kids. He had never talked about these things before. He was pushing 80. She was 12. So we've got a gap here of more than 60 years. And yet she was getting the living voice of somebody who had lived through that. This is not like a long game of telephone with a lot of links. That's pretty close up. The Gospels were, I am persuaded, I have a lecture on this and books I can give you on this. They were written by people who were alive at the time, some of whom were eyewitnesses to the events, some of whom were acquaintances, directly acquainted with the eyewitnesses, and they were written within the generation that witnessed these things. None of them were written in the 2nd century. But beyond that, Paul's epistles were written earlier than that, and in 1 Corinthians 15 we have something very interesting, which is it begins with an early creed that Paul is clearly not making up. This is what was used for catechesis. This is what was used for training converts. And that creed is itself about the resurrection. He says that which was delivered to me is what I gave to you. And then he talks about Jesus' death and his burial and his resurrection and the people he was seen by, and he names them. He was seen by Cephas, and then all of the 12 disciples. He was seen 500 people at once. So he names these things, and it looks like these were built into the early creed. Joachim Jeremias and Oscar Cullman did a lot of work on early creeds that are embedded in Paul's epistles, and this one in 1 Corinthians 15 is maybe the most significant of them all. That creed was, almost everybody agrees, Bart Ehrman, who's certainly no fan of Christianity, agrees, was circulating in Palestine within a few years of Jesus' crucifixion as a method of catechesis, where there were people who were principal actors in the story. The night of his betrayal, Peter was still around. They didn't run away and leave Jerusalem. It spread outward from Jerusalem, as both the New Testament and the Roman historian Tacitus say. In Tacitus' Annals, book 15, chapter 44, talks about how this superstition, he doesn't believe in it, but he says it began in Jerusalem and it spread all the way to Rome. And then he has disparaging remarks about Rome. Funny for a Roman historian. But there's no doubt that this claim of the resurrection, with details, with names of eyewitnesses, was circulating within a couple of years. Some skeptics say, by the fall of the year that Jesus was crucified, this was going around already. This was the means by which new converts were catechized. This is how they were taught. This is the creed they were given. And it fits together perfectly well with what we have in the Gospels. And there is no other story that has any face of plausibility. The Gnostic Gospels from the 2nd century are hilarious. I wish more people would read them, because then fewer people would talk about them, and that would be a good thing.
Tim, that passage was 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8.
Yeah, 3 through 8. It might. Some people say, maybe it terminates at verse 7. Okay, that's fine. I'm not going to quibble about that. But it's very simple and rhythmic in Greek, in particular. If you read it in Greek, you can see it. And that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the scriptures, and ascended into heaven, and but after he was buried and risen, he was seen by this person, and then by this person, and by this person. There's this kai hoti construction in Greek that's and that this, and that this, and that this, designed for easy memorization. It's not very long. It's something that you could memorize in a lazy afternoon and still take a nap before dinner. But it was supposed to be the creed, which Paul said he delivered to them, which he had also received. That's an almost exact Greek translation of a Hebrew phrase that the rabbis use when they're talking about passing down learning from one rabbi to another. My rabbi taught me this, and now I'm your rabbi, and I'm delivering it to you just as it was taught to me. And Paul, of course, rabbinically trained, finds nothing unusual at all about using that form of words.
And as I understand, it's been dated for about around 8 years after the crucifixion.
Actually, most people place it within 4 or 5. And this includes atheists, Jewish historians, skeptics of all stripes. This is not just sort of an optimistic dating. That creed is usually placed to within 2 to 4 years is the normal window. And some people say it goes back all the way to the first fall. So you're pretty much on top of the events at that point. And by historical standards, that's just crazy good. We very rarely get that close to anything, any major historical event, with anything that was written down or constructed or passed around at that time. That's phenomenally good testimony.
I'm sorry, that was 1 Corinthians 15?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right, 1 Corinthians 15, beginning at verse 3.
Thank you.
For I delivered unto you that which I also received, and then goes on from there. I see a hand.
How do you know that they were written at 4 years after, other than hearing it from a scholar? How could you?
How do I know? Right. So the reasons that are given have to do with the way that we know that that oral communication in societies tend to develop, with certain aspects of them that reflect things that changed pretty early. For example, Christianity originated in Jerusalem, where Jesus was crucified, and then very quickly spread outward to a much wider range of people. In Jerusalem, Aramaic was widely spoken. It was a Syriac dialect of Hebrew. And Aramaic was not widely spoken in the region further out. So as soon as Christianity spread out to the wider region where Greek was the more common language, you would expect Greek terminology and particularly Greek names to be used for people to recognize people. But if you look at that creed in 1 Corinthians 15, it gives a name for Peter in Aramaic. He appeared to Cephas. And some translations will render it Peter because they want you to know who it was. But they're doing for you the very thing that would have been done as this creed was spread outward and people were asking, who's Cephas? That's a weird name. Who calls his kid Cephas? Well, that's the Aramaic word. It means rock. Peter is the name that, from Petra, that you would understand it in Greek. And so Petros would be what they would have written if it had been written much later than the origin of the religion itself, because by that time it would have spread out, would have developed there. But this was written at ground zero when the community was still largely people who were very comfortable speaking Aramaic as a daily language, very shortly after the origins of Christianity, as attested even by people like I said, like Tacitus, who says that it rapidly spread all the way to Rome. It would have had to have been constructed in the lingua franca of the majority of the Christian community, which would have been Koine Greek rather than Aramaic. So the fact that the name is in Aramaic there is a linguistic marker of its early date. Does that help?
Yeah.
There are other linguistic markers that are similar, other aspects, Aramaic aspects of it if you back translate it into Aramaic. But I'm going to leave that for the people who are more fluent in both languages than I am. But the name of Peter there is one of the distinctive markers, and that reference to Cephas is a token of quite an early date. You'll notice that by the time the book of Acts is written, it's taken for granted that the world knows this guy as Peter, and then that's how he appears everywhere, right? But the name Cephas, that you get only in something that is pretty close to the ground zero of it, or from somebody who knew him personally well before he became widely known as Peter. It's a really good question, because we do want to calibrate these things. We don't just want to say, oh, well, some scholars say, and then sort of take their word for it, because, well, some scholars say a lot of things, and how do I know which ones to trust? So one does want to be able to drill down a little bit on that, so I like the question.
Cited Hume as a major opponent to miracles. Is there a contemporary one, more recent one that you know of?
Oh, sure. I mean, there are a number of people who are very much Humean in their thought. Ironically, one of them is Bart Ehrman, even though he says that he's not giving Hume's objection. But actually, he just is mistaken about what Hume's objection was, and he is giving Hume's objection, a kind of a poor man's version of it. But Bart Ehrman, of course, the world's best-known apostate, who's made millions of dollars selling books attacking Christianity, he's definitely peddling Hume. Graham Oppy is an Australian philosopher who has done work in metaphysics and philosophy of religion, and he's just full bore, 100% on board with Hume. Oppy and I had an exchange in a book published in 2016 called 4 Views on Christianity and Philosophy, and you can see there our back and forth about this. And it's good to watch somebody put his case in his own words. Larry Shapiro out at the University of Wisconsin-Madison is a philosopher who's written a book on the resurrection, which, he's just straight retailing Hume. He has actually no significant modification. He barely mentions John Ehrman's book, which is hilarious, because Ehrman is, of course, the thing that you would have to engage with to do this at a high level. But he's writing for the masses, and he wants to convince them that Hume was right. And Larry and I have had an exchange on a blog. There's a blog called The Open Table, which is run by a couple of people, one of whom's a former graduate student of mine. And so if you want to look that one up, or I can just send you links to that, and then you can all see Shapiro make his case in his own words, and see me make my case in my own words. Much more fun than watching me make his case in my words.
Any other questions for Tim?
If you do have other questions but you think of them afterwards, don't worry about it. Just ask Donald. I will have given him permission to give my email address out. So if you think of something later, you're like, but wait, there was this crushing objection. I just couldn't think of it on the time. That's fine. Send it to me. We do have one more.
So judges in the court of law typically deal with a lot of testimony. If a judge heard something miraculous like any given extreme miracle claim, what evidence would he need to see to actually reasonably believe it? Right?
This is a really good question because of two things. Number one, we have people who were experts in the law of evidence who've actually written about this. So one of them is Simon Greenleaf, and he's got a book called The Testimony of Evangelists Evaluated by the Criteria Used in Courts of Law. So Greenleaf's Testimony of the Evangelist is a very important book. Greenleaf was the Harvard lawyer who wrote the textbook on the Anglo-American law of evidence that was most widely used in the United States in the latter half of the 19th century. So he certainly knew something about evidence. But more than that, there's a broader form of question of which this is just a special case. The broader form of question is when there's a conclusion that bears a very high burden of proof, how do we discharge that when the witnesses to the event, at least the witnesses who are willing to testify, are all dead and the trail is cold? And the answer to this is really fascinating because this is where we get cold case homicide detectives working on these things. By law, there is a high burden of proof for convicting someone of murder because there are very heavy penalties that come with that, and we want to be extra careful not to convict innocent parties. But cold cases that happened in the 1970s have been solved. A good friend of mine, J. Warner Wallace, is a retired cold case homicide detective, and you can find cases, look him up on Dateline. J, just the initial, Warner Wallace, Wallace. He actually has stories of cases where he picked up the trail of something where this woman disappeared and her husband didn't know where she had been. He said they'd had an argument and then she drove off and her body was never found. Husband went on, remarried, had a life, seemed to be a model upstanding citizen in the community. A grown son, and case got reopened, and Wallace got to work on written affidavits of people written at the time that it happened, decades ago. They were no longer available, and they took the guy to trial. And his sisters raised an enormous fuss. They started GoFundMe accounts for him and social media posts and blogs about how he was innocent. This terrible detective and this terrible lawyer were just persecuting their brother, who was this wonderful person, and he would never, etc. Took it to court. They got a conviction. The sisters were going bonkers. This is a miscarriage of justice. Our brother is innocent. We will fight. Yada yada yada. Came to the sentencing part of the hearings, and the judge said, "You need to tell us what you did with that body, or you're not going to see the outside of the jail again." And the guy looked at the judge, then he looked down, and he looked up again, and he said, "I'd like to talk to my lawyers." Jim was in the courtroom. He said he was looking across the courtroom where the guy's sisters were sitting. He said, "I saw the exact moment when they realized that their brother was a murderer." Cold cases, great test case for what kind of evidence we want. Jim talks about that specifically from his expertise as a homicide detective with regard to the resurrection in his book, Cold Case Christianity. So it's a nice case study of how somebody with that suite of tools who's actually done that kind of work goes about digging into the truth claims of Christianity. By the way, he was an adult atheist. He was not raised Christian. He was not happy when it turned out that this evidence was a lot better than he thought it was going to be.
And
Paige.
he will be at the conference in November, the Apologetics Conference in Parker.
Tell him I said hi.
Okay.
Could you share with us an anecdote or story of some experience you've had with somebody else where you've made some persuasive case for miracles with them, or they had the issue of miracles was really inhibiting their ability to come to faith, and how did you deal with that? How did you approach that issue?
So a lot depends on the individual, and I strongly recommend that we not try to go forward with a one-size-fits-all approach. People need different kinds of evidence. Some people would say, if there was a miracle that happened, so what? I don't care. True story begins, a Christian and two Buddhists walk into a bar. This really happened. Fort Worth, Texas. I was giving a talk in a bar for a group called the Bible and Beer Consortium. It's a wonderful group down in Texas where they get Christians and atheists together, and they bring in a speaker, could be a Christian, could be an atheist, and they do a talk, and then people grill them afterwards, and then we just have good conversations, and meanwhile, those who wish to partake of the local beverages are encouraged to do so. But I gave this talk, and somebody that told me, hey, there's a couple of Buddhists back here, they'd like to talk to you. So I went back wondering if I was going to see people in orange robes or something, but it was just two college kids, guy and a girl. She was a Buddhist because she'd had a very charismatic comparative religion professor. He was a Buddhist because she was a Buddhist. But I asked them, not long into the conversation, I said, if you were persuaded, whatever that would take, that Jesus of Nazareth was killed by Roman soldiers, put in a tomb, and then on the third day afterward, physically climbed up out of that tomb, was alive, and was seen by other people, what would you do? He looked at her, and she said, well, that would be interesting, but I don't really think anything would change. I'm comfortable with my values. I don't really think that would change anything. What would be the use of giving them a detailed argument for the resurrection? Right? I mean, at that point, they've just said it wouldn't make any difference. When people tell you that, take them seriously. I thanked them for their candor, and I did not try to press that line of argument because it was obvious that they were not in a position to take it seriously. Should they have been? Sure, absolutely. I think the response is crazy. But you can't make people take things seriously. You have to wait until they take them seriously. Someday, when she has dumped him and moved on and he hits a low point, maybe he'll say, I should rethink this. And that's all I can hope for. So sometimes good arguments fail. And that's okay as long as we didn't make them fail. As long as we didn't make people sorry they were ever talking to us, which is easy to do.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions?
Can we give Dr. McGrew an applause?
Yeah.